Coming up on this episode of the New Money Habits podcast.
Because you caught me off guard with your brilliance. That sounded worse than
I'm going to use that soundbite right there as the coming up in this episode. You
caught me off guard with your brilliance. That's pretty funny. Getting back into it's going to feel super awkward, but we're just going to go back to you being a genius, I think.
Hey there, budgeteers. The new year is here, and you know what that means. It's time for fresh starts and new habits. If one of your goals is to get better with your money, New Money Habits has exactly what you need to kick things off right, the Payday Power Planner. This isn't just any budget tool. The Payday Power Planner is designed to work with your pay periods, not just the calendar month. Why does that matter? Because it helps you to see exactly when your money is coming in and going out. No surprises, no guesswork. With the Payday Power Planner, you'll know if you're working with a surplus or facing a deficit, so you can make informed decisions about your money. It's not just a plan, it's the clarity and control you've been looking for to start the new year strong. Make this the year you finally build new habits for financial freedom. Grab your free Payday Power Planner from New Money Habits today and take the first step toward a better financial future. Visit newmoneyhabits.com now, because this year it's time for a better plan for your money. Good morning, Maria.
Good morning, sir.
I want to take a moment for our listeners to understand that we probably should just hit the record button about 15 minutes ago, because as we're kind of just talking about, hey, this is the topic we're going to discuss and high level stuff, then we get into all of the good stuff. And so we're going to try to recreate the magic a little bit for the listeners today as we discuss our topic for today. But before I get into that, it's a couple days into the new year, so kind of a happy new year again to you. And just wondering, how is 2025 unfolding for you so far?
So far, so good. I think today is the kids are starting to go back to school and we're supposed to try to get back into a routine. So, it's talk to me next week and I'll let you know how it actually is going. I think We're still kind of feeling the hangover of the whole break and all of that. But I think it's going to be a good year.
Yeah, I joked with the kids yesterday, and I said these teachers need to come and get their kids back.
Well, as a homeschool mom, I don't have that.
You don't get that.
The teacher just never comes and takes them back. But no, the older one does. So we have two older kids, and the one went back to school, back to college a couple days ago, and then the high schooler started back today. And so I just have the two little ones still. So it's just a matter of getting back into routine.
Yep, absolutely. It is Monday of the first week after the new year, and that's exactly, where we're all at, is kind of getting back into the routine. But then we're probably trying to also stay committed to some of those New Year's goals that we have set for ourselves, where it's like, hey, I want to try to do this and that. And so getting back to a routine will also oftentimes be that first hurdle, that first challenge to, can I actually stay on task here, or is everything going to just blow up in my face because I have to get back to the quote normal routine?
Right. Yeah. I mean, working your new goals and aspirations into the routine is probably a good way to start that, I think.
Yeah. So my best wishes go out to listeners who are trying to manage all of that, getting back into the routine, but also taking in those new habits into the new year. So speaking of new habits into the new year and kind of goal setting, I know that this time of year, there's usually a big push for people to do things kind of radical. And one of those radical things that just happen to exist out in our world of personal finance is historically they were called no spend challenges. So I remember no spend November, and I've actually done an episode in the past about no spend November challenge not accepted. But it maybe has evolved into, it's not just no spend challenges, but there's these no buys or low buy challenges. Net is, you're being challenged to do something different with your money. And I know that there's a big push because it's the new year. I know that in fact, we had somebody we've collaborated with in the past reach out to us and say, hey, I have this Facebook group that's growing by leaps and bounds, actually titled 2025 No Spend Challenge. We have over 100,000 people in that group. And there's a lot of great conversation going on over there about how to implement a no spend or a low spend or a no buy or a low buy. You and I, we think words matter. So
Hmm.
I kind of want to even just start the conversation with maybe changing the perspective a little bit from a no spend or a no buy, low spend, low buy to something a little bit more active and what's the other word I'm looking for? Effective, productive. I don't know.
Okay. Well, before we go changing anything, and because words matter, I think it's really interesting how fast that group grew.
Grew.
It didn't sound right to say group grew, but here we are.
Yeah.
See everybody Monday morning, first thing after the new year. So no, I do. I think it's very interesting how fast that group grew, and I think it's because words matter. And so
Mm-hmm.
before we change it, if we could just kind of talk about that a little bit, I think it would be great. People obviously gravitate toward something like this. I don't know if it's just the challenge of it, maybe it's just a mere curiosity. I don't know what the reason is, but I mean, we're talking like overnight growth, right? I mean, it. I'm not totally overnight, but over the course of a week, it grew by about 100,000, and it was without any advertising and without
Mm-hmm.
any push, really. It's just people saw that title, I think, and were like, yes, this is what I want. And I know in my other podcast we've talked about what people want versus what they think they want. And I think you and I actually had a conversation about that as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm kind of thinking that that ties in here too, where it's like they think they want this no spend challenge because it's so exciting, but what do they actually want? And if we're going to make any changes to the words, maybe we try to figure out what it is that they're actually wanting.
Mm. I think that's a really important point. And just for clarification, not that I don't know if our listeners even care. It's not as though we're even suggesting that we would rename the group. The
Of
group is
course.
the group name, but yeah, what is the attraction there, right? What
Yeah.
are they truly attracted to? What do they think they want versus what do they actually want? And I know that we've spent some time helping to admin the group, and the group is really kind of fueling itself at this point. I mean, the
Yeah.
conversations are very organic, and so it's hard to kind of even keep up with all the things that people are talking about. But what are some of the trends that you're noticing when you see like the different questions people are posting or the different claims that they're making about what they're trying to not spend on and that sort of thing? So like I'm just curious, what have you noticed trend wise?
Well, I haven't spent a ton of time in there, if I'm being fully honest. But when I'm in there, some of the stuff that I'm seeing is they want an understanding of why they're doing what they're doing in the first place. So like they
Mm,
came thinking, I'm gonna do this challenge, and then it becomes exactly that. It becomes a challenge. Like, why
yep.
is this so stinking difficult for me to actually be able to follow through with? And they're starting to dig a little bit deeper and ask the question, why? Like what whether it is some sort of pathological thing, whether it's something that just is ingrained in them since childhood. They're just trying to figure out what is the reason that this is so stinking difficult. And that's one of the trends I'm seeing.
Yeah. Last week we talked about goal setting for the new year in lieu of resolutions, and we talked about having a plan. And
Hmm.
so the plan is this challenge, right? The challenge kind of almost becomes somebody's plan. Okay, this is my plan. I'm not going to spend. But we also talked about having a purpose. And
Hmm.
and so like you said, like why though? What is it about this no spend challenge that you think is going to help you with your finances? And so um, I've seen a similar trend where it's people are trying to either share why they're trying to do something, but far more often I'm noticing it's I'm sharing the what. I'm not sharing the how or the why. So I'm not
Mm-hmm.
even sharing the plan or the purpose. I'm just sharing the what. And I think that's what I want to encourage listeners today. Like, you got to move past just the what
Mm-hmm.
in any area of your finances. Like, I'm going to create a budget. Okay, that's the what, why, and how. Or I'm going to reduce my spending in this category. Okay, again, that's the what, why, and how. But another trend that I'm noticing is where people are looking for kind of the guidelines and the guardrails. And so, to give an example, somebody was asking about, like, what are the different percentages in the different categories that I should be spending? And I had to jump in and just, like, caution. Percentages are very misleading, because if I tell you that, oh, you should only spend about 10% of your budget on food, just making up numbers, but if I'm
Mm-hmm.
like 10% of your budget on food, well, for a single person who makes really good money, let's say they bring home $10,000 a month, they really going to spend $1,000 on food? And
I
then
guess it depends on where they live.
maybe, but then for a family of four who may only bring home half of that, $5,000 a
Mm-hmm.
month, are we really going to tell them that they should only be spending $500 a month on food? So the percentage doesn't make sense. I
Yeah.
think we should be thinking about these things in a different way.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm glad that I let you speak all that out before jumping in, because when you said percentages can be misleading, it's like, oh, but I actually talk about percentages with people, but it's a totally different way that you're than what you're
Mm,
describing. So what you're saying is there should be no just blanket rule of, 10% of your income should go to your food and 25% to housing, etc. And I was not there to see that particular post, so I'm assuming that that's exactly what they were asking.
hmm
But what I do like, when I do like percentages for budgeting, it's so that it makes the things a little bit less complicated than, say, a zero-based budget, especially if you don't know what it is that you're spending in, or how that's going to play out. And so I know a lot of people just give up on a zero-based budget because it's so meticulous, and they're like, I just don't even know all the info. And so going percentages can help. However, to your point, it is a very individualized plan, and it's
hmm
different than what you were just talking about. So I agree with you that if you try to just blanketly assign percentages to something, it's not likely to work, because everybody has their own numbers. That it's individualized, it's unique. So we need to make sure that we're careful with that.
Yeah. And I'll leave the rest of that for a different episode for a different day. But I think it was an interesting comment. It was an interesting conversation that kind of ensued. But getting back to this kind of idea that words matter,
Yeah.
and that, like I said, I've done a podcast episode in the past where I said, no spend November, challenge not accepted, because I don't, there's just something about this idea of no spend that I think it misses the mark. I think there's something in it that it's like, I understand what you're after, but I think this no spend challenge is not necessarily the full answer. And so I've talked to clients about the idea of a smart spend. So
Mm.
instead of a no spend or a low spend, it's all like, how about we just go with a smart spend? But this is exactly the reason we should hit the record button earlier, because we were talking about that and hoping to recreate some of the magic, because you had a really great point about even smart spend might still not be quite what we're looking for.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming that you're going with like the whole SMART goals that we talked about last week. Is that a fair assumption?
Oh, that's a really good question. No, just
It wasn't. Okay. Well, then
more just
my
like smart almost as a synonym, and I know these two words are not synonyms, but almost
Mhm.
as a replacement for like mindful. Let's be
Mhm.
mindful about what you're spending. So smart spend was more like, let's be smart about
Mm-hmm.
the way we're spending.
Okay. So when you and I were first talking, I actually thought that maybe you meant it in relationship to SMART goals, just because it was so recent. And having said that, though, now that I know that wasn't, then I actually double down on my dislike of that word.
Yes.
So,
I'm so glad you said that.
um, so if we're looking at it in the way I thought you were, that we're wanting to have, measurable and that type of goal,
Specific,
type of
measurable. Yeah.
specific, yes. I think that actually would make sense. And yet the reason that I didn't like it was just because I think SMART kind of carries with it a sense of, I don't know. I don't really want to say judgment, but I'm going to say judgment because I think that even though I can handle judgment and I know our listeners can handle judgment, there's still that undertone of good or bad. And I don't think that's super productive for us. I don't think that when we're thinking about spending, if it's good or bad, when there's that judgment that's attached to it, it almost makes it even more difficult to let go of or to engage in, even if it would be productive spending. So I think that that's one of the biggest reasons. And since you didn't mean it by that, you actually said, no, it actually, I'm talking about like smart versus, let's take that logically to the next level. What would the opposite of smart be, right?
The
Stupid,
opposite of,
stupid
yeah,
spending. And
right.
so I think since words matter and we talk to ourselves when we're doing it, we want to be very careful about how we label some of this stuff. And so as much as you were wanting to swap out something like mindful, I actually would gravitate a little bit more towards that. And I think it's because something like mindful or intentional is something that can be personalized. So it's universal enough where people understand what mindful is, but it's personalizable enough. I don't even know if that's a word, but we're going with it today.
We're
Um,
making it.
that you're as you are making decisions about what you're spending on, what you are choosing not to spend on. If you're doing that in a mindful way, then that's where it becomes personal, and because your circumstances are different than the next person and then the next person, etc. So I think that's why I like that a little bit better. But there must have been a reason that you were ditching mindful for something like smart, and I'm definitely open to hearing that.
No, 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 no. Not that I was ditching mindful. I, like I said, I was kind of just using smart to replace mindful. Even before I had thought like,
Oh,
oh,
okay.
this is
Okay.
how I'm using it, right? So I
Yeah.
kind of only came to the realization today that no, I think what I really was aiming for was more of like a mindful spend.
Okay.
Um, and I agree that mindful is general enough and specific enough for somebody to be able to individualize and apply it to their situation. You know, small little tangent of background here. I've been coaching clients since 2013. So what that time and that experience has shown me is when I first got started, everything was very rigid and everything was like, you have to do it this way, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
one way to do this if you want to be successful. And the truth of the matter is, the more I worked with people, the more they challenged that line of thinking, and they're like, Nino, love you. I appreciate all that you're helping me to do. There is no way on God's green earth I'm going to do that. So can
Mm-hmm.
you please help me find a different path? Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay. So as I opened up my mind to, there are principles or guiding principles that everybody is going to benefit from, how one exercises that principle is going to be a little bit different. And it ties to this, where it's like, let's be mindful about the way we're spending. So it's a principle that everybody can benefit from. How somebody puts that principle into practice is going to be different for them than most other people.
Yeah, I agree. And with 100,000 people in that group, there are probably about 99 to 100,000 different ways for someone to do something and circumstances that are just different. And so I really do appreciate the fact that we're looking for something that's not such a blanket statement.
Hey there, budgeteers. Good news can only be good news if there's bad news. So, what's the bad news? The bad news is you and I have a deadly disease called sin. and this disease causes us to rebel and disobey God. See, God is holy, righteous, and just, and he cannot be in the presence of sin. So this horrible disease of ours separates us from the God who created us. And the bad news gets worse. There isn't anything you or I can do to make ourselves right with God. We are dead in our sins and on our way to an eternity separated from God. But that's not God's will for us. See, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. God did what only God could do. He made a way for us to be reconciled to him through Jesus Christ. Jesus came into the world to save sinners like you and me. While we were still sinners, storing up God's anger against us for our rebellion and disobedience, Christ died for us. Jesus took the punishment that you and I deserve and have earned. Jesus is the substitute for your punishment and mine. Now, isn't that some good news? The word gospel means good news. The gospel of Jesus Christ is that you and I broke God's law and Jesus paid the fine. When we place our faith and trust in Jesus, we get to experience God's grace and mercy. Our gratitude should turn us from our rebellious and disobedient sin toward God, seeking after him and his righteousness. When we do, God gives us a new heart and a new mind. Praise God for his goodness, and remember, God loves, humans sin, Jesus saves. So let's take this theory and this idea high level of mindful spend, and let's dig into it a little bit and figure out how can we help somebody practically apply this general principle in their own situation in a way that's going to be very personalized and unique to them. And I want to start that conversation, that part of the conversation, by saying, I think when we're talking about mindful spend, or even if you did apply this to the words no spend, what you have, I think the very first step somebody has to take is identify where you're uncomfortable with your spending. So I'll say that a couple different ways because I don't think there's just one way. It's not that you have to identify the place where you're overspending. That might be true for some people. You might be overspending somewhere and you need to identify, where am I overspending? But for others, it might not even be that you're overspending. It's just that whatever spending you're doing in that category, you're uncomfortable doing because maybe you have some preconceived notion that you're not supposed to spend in a category or that much. And so I'll give another example because this happens with almost every client I sit down with for the first time. Most people I sit down with are not overspending in food. They're just not. But they have this script in their head that they are overspending or that they shouldn't be spending that much to feed their family. And when we take a look at how much are you spending versus how big is your family versus just the cost of goods nowadays, I can usually help people realize like, oh, I'm not actually overspending, but they were uncomfortable with their spend in that category. So that first step is identify kind of the areas that you want to change your spending habits.
Has anyone told you you're brilliant?
I mean, thank you for those very kind words, but no.
Okay. Well, you're brilliant. What you just said is actually really insightful, and I think that more listeners need to hear that. And you might not even know the part I'm talking about.
Nope.
But it's
I'm like on the edge
he's
of
like
my
ready to
seat.
take
Like,
notes. Tell me where I'm a
Yep.
genius. It's in that idea of the script that we have written for ourselves or that other
Mhm.
people have written on our behalves, and we just read it and then are continuing to read it over to ourselves. And the example that you used was in happens to be in the category of food. And I know after having conversations with you on a regular basis, like why that's so important to you. Like you actually put food ahead of anything else, shelter, clothing, all those things.
Mhm.
And I appreciate that you do that. What I want to draw out there is that whole idea of we're telling ourselves we're overspending because we have this script in our minds, and yet the script is wrong. It's not even accurate. And so being able
Mm.
to help them change the script first before jumping into changing the numbers is brilliant. And I just wanted to point that out to you. So your um clients are lucky people. Okay, so I agree with everything that you just said. I would like to actually add a little bit to the beginning of it though, if I can. And that's you said, it's important to identify like what areas you're uncomfortable spending in or where you want to change some of that, what categories. And I would actually say before you even identify what categories you think that you are overspending in or uncomfortable in, identifying the categories themselves. And I know you're probably like, what are you talking about? But I've noticed that if a category has been given to us, very much like the script that you had mentioned a couple seconds ago, it's not ours. It was handed over to us. And so one of the things that I've noticed over the years of coaching is that if something isn't relatable, then it's really hard to actually dig in. And I'll give you an example of this. So if you've got
Mhm.
the whole idea of like just breaking things up into housing and transportation and needs versus wants and what are some of the other categories that are typical
Subscriptions,
subscription, yeah.
debt.
People have a hard time sometimes going, I'm overspending in this particular area. And so what I've had fun doing is having them like name their own categories because it might not be something that is typical. We've talked about, putting a roof over your head, like that actually being the way that we talk about it. Because it's for that, it's technically, yes, it's the roof and it might include some utilities and that kind of stuff, but it allows the individual to say, this is the area that I feel connected to. And when someone feels connected to something, they're more likely to actually be able to identify what is comfortable, what's not comfortable for them.
Yeah. As you're mentioning like these different categories, I can't remember the examples, but in the past, Sarah had given some really cool examples of categories
Mm,
that I thought were like truly unique, where it's like, and again, I can't remember those examples off the top of my head, but I get what you're saying, where it's like, if I'm handed, um, once upon a time, I created a budgeting form when I was independent, and I think it just said like bills and subscriptions. Our payday power planner now has a category that says enjoy your hard earned money a bit.
mm-hmm,
So it might still include those bills and subscriptions, but you're telling yourself in this category, I want to enjoy some of my hard earned money.
mm-hmm,
And then there's other things like modern day necessities. So bills and subscriptions back in the day would have included like cell phone and internet. Cell phone and internet today is darn very, very close to a
to
necessity.
essential, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, now it says modern day necessities, and those two things are in that category. And so, right, these more personalized categories that tell a different story, right? If I tell myself that I get to enjoy some of my hard-earned money, then I can be more mindful about what do I want in that category. You
Right.
know, and I think about my own, and it does include like we got rid of cable and satellite years ago. And so we have some streaming apps because we want to enjoy our hard-earned money a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah,
Yeah,
I like
and
that.
and so the other thing that I tend to do is label things differently. So, and this actually goes to the mindfulness. So I hope you don't feel like we're on a tangent. So if you're listening today, you just kind of put some of these pieces together. But when you're trying to be mindful, you have to know what you're mindful of, right? If you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, it's going to be difficult to actually make something happen. So, I like to use the example of, you know, a Starbucks thing. So I actually have different categories where we talk about, maybe something is used for connection, maybe something is used for legacy, maybe something is just wasteful. And I'll just give the three examples of that. So if you're going to Starbucks and you're wanting to create memories with your sister, you're meeting your sister, you haven't seen her for a long time, here you are, you decide this is the place you're going to meet. That transaction is going to be different than maybe we're going to sit and meet with coffee for a potential business meeting, or a potential business partner, and we're going to meet with them. And so we're buying them coffee. That's going to be a different category that's going to go under legacy spending versus I just am going to pick up my kids from school. My car turns without me even knowing, and I all of a sudden in the Starbucks, drive
Yeah.
through. That would be more of a wasteful, mindless spending. And so all those transactions could be the exact same amount, but if you're trying to figure out where you're overspending and you're just looking at your statements and going, oh, Starbucks, 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 Starbucks. Oh, I shouldn't go to Starbucks anymore. Well, why? Like, whether you like Starbucks or not, it's just
Yeah.
an example. But it's like it doesn't matter. You could say I'm just going to go anytime I want, or you could say I'm never going to go at all. But I might venture to say neither one of those is healthy. Like, figure out why you're going to go and then be more intentional with it.
Yeah. I love it. And I want to bring it back to like the example you've used in the past. So I know that on even the payday power planner, we have like put food on the table, or like this particular category can go either under put food on the
Mm,
table, or it could be um, enjoy your hard earned money a bit, but you could have eating out. But
hmm
you have shared in the past that you specifically have eating out for connection and eating out for convenience. And so if that was just eating out, you might look at that category and say, I either overspend or I'm uncomfortable with the spend or I want to go into a no spend challenge and I want to cut out the eating out.
hmm
But because you are so mindful about that category, it actually serves more than one purpose. There's eating out for convenience, and maybe that's the one where you're like, I want to be a little bit more mindful. I want to maybe reduce my spending in that particular category because I want to shop my cabinet first, and I want to make maybe more connections at home with the kids, teaching them how to cook and bake and do these things, and we have that experience together. And so that would be a very mindful reason for why you might want to reduce that portion of eating out. But
hmm
the eating out for connection, you might say to yourself, there's no way I'm giving that up because connection is so important to me. I continue to want to spend in that area. And so then it's just about putting some guardrails around like how much, right? Because the other part of this is like we're not talking about unlimited spend in that
hmm
category. It's about, okay, I want to spend. Now let me be thoughtful and mindful about how much I'm spending, out of my budget.
Yeah, and then not even just as how much you're going to spend, but when I have dining out for connection on my actual line item, if we're spending from that category, then we darn well better be connecting during that particular
Hmm.
meal, right? So
Right.
it's not just a dodge. It's not like just a loophole of, oh, I'm just going to call it connection, and so that way I can actually still do this. Like, you actually want to be mindful of, are we going to make sure that no one has their cell phone out on the table when we are out dining for connection? Are we going to engage in conversation with the person that I'm sitting across from? Because that actually is important and it's part of the mindful process. And just like anything else, when we talk about anything on this show, we don't just talk about numbers. The numbers are feedback for us, and they help to create that guardrail. But if you stop there, I guarantee you're not going to be satisfied.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not going to be long term success. You might have some short term gains, but yeah, if you're not addressing the motivation, the purpose, the plan, all
Yeah.
of it collectively. Hey there, budgeteers. It's a brand new year, and that means it's time for new habits, starting with your money. Take charge of your finances in 2025 with New Money Habits Financial Coaching. This isn't your typical financial advice. New Money Habits is all about giving you the knowledge, tools, and support to make confident money moves and build a rock solid financial foundation. Here's the deal, we're offering a free discovery session to kick off your journey to financial freedom. That's right, no strings attached. In this session, one of our expert coaches will help you to identify your financial goals and create a better plan for your money. We'll help you master your money mindset, sharpen your money management skills, and keep you accountable every step of the way. Make 2025 the year you say goodbye to financial stress and hello to the freedom you've been dreaming about. Schedule your free discovery session today and start creating the new money habits you need to achieve financial freedom. So, we talked about, I'm going to try to start to summarize some of the things that we've said to kind of build some steps that our listeners can follow. So we talked about first, like recognizing the scripts that we've told ourselves, the things that we believe. We have to reflect on the things that we think are true with money, and either kind of validate those beliefs or challenge those beliefs so that we know. And again, we go back to whether or not you should be spending that much money on food to feed your family. Feeding your family is a priority, and so that should be the script: is feeding my family is a priority, and then go from there. Then it's the next thing is identify the areas you want to change your spending habits. So now that you've reflected on the different areas, you can start to identify, this is an area that I want to change my spending habits. It's not necessarily just simply like I want to no spend or reduce spend. It's I just want to change my habits in this area. From there, this may or may not be the next step, but I think from there, it's now that you identify the area, being able to then identify, why do you spend the way you spend? Why do you behave the way you behave? What are the triggers? I think understanding, why do I spend the way I spend, is the next thing.
Well, I can give you a hint. Doing all of the work that you just mentioned with figuring out what your beliefs are, it's probably going to be a good springboard for why you spend the way you spend. So oftentimes, I know you and I have talked about cognitive behavioral connections, and the way that we think oftentimes creates a way that we feel, which then results in how we behave and then has some sort of consequence. And that consequence will either, like you said, validate or challenge our thought or a belief. And then the process continues on and on and on. And so, if you want to interrupt what's going on behaviorally, you oftentimes need to interrupt what's happening mentally, and so cognitively. So when you're trying to identify what those beliefs are, if it's leading to a spot where you're like, I don't like this. So let's take your example of the overspending in, and I'm using air quotes, in the category of feeding your family. So if the thought is I'm overspending, and then you go and maybe your feeling about that is guilt, and so you might pull back on spending, and then your family doesn't get enough food, and so let's see, how would this go? So your family doesn't get enough food, so now you feel guilty again. And if you don't change that thought of that, you mentioned feeding my family is a priority. If you change that, then there's not the guilt around that. There's actually a sense of empowerment of, okay, so I'm actually feeling good about feeding my family and I'm spending this particular amount of money. Because a lot of times that guilt will turn into what I like to call apathy spending, because it's a lot nicer way of saying F it. And that is what I've gotten into that before. And I used to say that was like 80% of our credit card spending was F it spending. It's just that whole idea of, I'm never going to get out of this anyway, so I might as well just keep going and doing the things that I want to do. And so it was just like this constant cycle that was just hard to break. So if you can get out of that guilt. Now you feel empowered, and so you're still gonna spend, but it won't spend as much because there's not any of that effort to spending, the apathy spending, the I can't do this anymore. I'm giving up. And a lot of times that
Mm,
spending is where that happens. That's where we spend beyond what we actually can. And so interrupting that thought is what's going to be important to do.
excellent. It, as you mentioned moments ago, it really is about getting into your own head about like why I behave the way I behave and changing things mentally before just implementing a new thought, a new trend, you know,
Yeah,
jumping on.
yeah, and I didn't do a very good job of being succinct with it, but that it's because if you don't, like, let's just say you change the behavior, okay?
Yep.
You don't touch the thought, so your feeling is actually not touched either, because if you don't change one, the feeling stays the same. So let's say you just jump in at your behavior. If that behavior does not create a consequence that then challenges your thought and helps you to change that thought, you're going to continue being in that cycle. It's going to still feel disjointed. You maybe do it for a little while because it's just sheer will at that point. Like, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. But if that underlying belief has not been changed, it will eventually just break. The cycle has to be there. So that's why it's so, sometimes it's like, well, I'm just going to change the behavior. And that's true. We can do that. But we have to make sure that we recognize that different outcome and let that outcome then affect the way that we're thinking. Does that make sense? Otherwise, if you need to start somewhere, start with the belief.
Right. Yeah. No, I think about how, to your point, you can jump into any new behavior, right? Whether it's like a fitness thing, I'm going to start working out, or it's, I'm going to stop spending in this category, or I'm going to do this, or I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
You can jump into it and you can have success early on. And you might even achieve some of your goals short term. But in order to have sustainable success, like a truly new behavior, you have to address what you think, why you think that, and what's a what's a different perspective that you can have on that.
Yeah.
So
The narrative that you play will affect the long term results.
um, I'm trying to think how I can kind of apply to like back in August, my wife and I started a new diet and we kind of just jumped into it. And at first, I didn't really, other than knowing, like, okay, clothes have gotten a little bit tighter. So I just want to at least get back down to kind of my normal weight. So just to make all of this concrete, I usually hang out between like 180 and 185. That's normally just where I am. I was up to 197, which is not like crazy, but that's still like 10 to 12 pounds. And I was just like, I want to get back down to like 180, 185 where I hang out. So she's on, somehow she found herself on the carnivore diet side of TikTok and everybody talking about the carnivore diet.
Mm-hmm.
So she's all like, hey, let's give this a try. But we did talk about it long enough at the beginning to say, hey, let's kind of do what it suggests for like 2 weeks. Let's just do it for 2 weeks and then kind of see how we like it, how we're feeling, that sort of thing. And then we'll so it wasn't like a, hey, this is going to be our lifestyle for the rest of our lives. It was like, hey, we're looking for some short term
Mm-hmm.
results. But I also am old enough and wise enough to know that if we do that and then just simply go back to what we were doing before, I'm going to gain the weight again. So we started it, and but we started it with some mindfulness around like do it for 2 weeks. Did it for the 2 weeks. I tell you, by day 3, I was having serious sugar withdrawal. Like I was just somebody who snacked all the time, late night bowls of cereal, all that stuff. And I could feel it. I'm like, oh, I don't like this. And interestingly enough, though, it wasn't, I don't like this, so I'm going to go back to what I was doing to get rid of it. It was, I don't like this, so power through it.
Mm-hmm.
to overcome it. And so here we are, all these months later, and instead of hanging out between 180 and 185, I now hang out between 175 and 180. I'm actually
Nice.
lighter,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel so much better. And over the time, like for me, it really is refined sugar. So that
Mm-hmm.
was the thing that I needed to, in
Kick.
this analogy, I needed to stop spending on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stop spending on refined
Mm-hmm.
sugar. But I found some great alternatives that allow me to kind of satisfy my sweet tooth without the other things. And so I think with money, you can do the same thing where it's like when you're looking to reduce spending or just get control of and be more mindful about your spending in an area, if you can really think about why am I doing it, my purpose, what is my plan of attack, how am I going to go about that, and you build in some checkpoints on like how is this going, is this going in the direction I want it to go, what what can I do. Like I said, we were really committed for the first 2 weeks, and carnivore is like no sugar, no carbohydrates. So there's no fruits, no vegetables, no nothing. After 2 weeks, we're like, hey, I think we can like have a strawberry. I think it'll be okay. Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so building in those moments of reflection to say, like, how is this plan going? Like, we're seeing some results, and that's great. Are we going to stay hardcore? Are we going to pull back a little bit? If we're going to pull back, where? How is that going to happen? But here it is, January. So what does that mean? It's been like 4 or
4
5
months.
months.
Mm-hmm.
And I can count on one hand how many times I've had like sweets with sugar in it
Mm-hmm.
and like cheated and just said,
Mm-hmm.
like, oh,
Which is a big deal through Christmas time. So well done.
yes. Well, think so. We did this in August. My wife's birthday is in September. Mine is in October. There's Thanksgiving in November, Christmas in December. So that is just usually, and it's football season. So there's
Mm-hmm.
usually lots of pizza and junk food, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was incredibly, I'm not going to say it was incredibly difficult because it wasn't.
It was
It's incredibly
challenging.
interesting that we went that route at that time of year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. But
Yeah.
well done. Well done.
Thanks. I'm
Yeah.
brilliant and I get a well done in this
That
episode.
I'm telling you, like this is the way to kick off the year.
Yeah. Get Nino's head and ego so big that,
That's right.
can't fill the screen anymore. Or he does fill the screen out. Anyway, we have derailed. We are off the rails. All right. So with that being said, since we are off the rails, why don't I just wrap this thing up? Unless you have some other kind of final thoughts and ideas before I do so.
I mean, I did, but I've lost my choo-choo, so so we can table it for another time. It's totally fine.
All right. Well, if you've hung out with us this long, thank you for listening.
God bless
We
you.
appreciate you. And just as a quick summary, as you're thinking about challenging yourself with your spending habits in the new year, whether you choose to adopt a no spend, low spend, no buy, low buy, or just more of like a mindful spend, identify the things that you've been telling yourself, the things that you believe, and where those beliefs came from. Identify the areas you want to change your habits, your spending habits, and identify why you spend the way you spend. And those three things will help you to create purpose and a plan for moving ahead. And if you need any help with that, look at our show notes to schedule time with either Maria or myself to have a conversation, to talk about it with your specific details in your specific situation so that you can have a plan that's personalized to you.
Yeah, and that help could be either after you've identified all that stuff or help identifying those things. I think
Yep.
that's sometimes that's where we get stuck, honestly. Like, oh, well, listen to this thing, and they said do these three things, and then get help, and it's like I don't even know where to start finding those three things. And so sometimes just having a neutral party, being able to just listen through and draw that out of you, will be a help in and of itself. So don't stop just because you can't identify those things on your own.
Absolutely. Get help to identify those things.
Yeah.
We'd love to talk to you. That does it for this episode of the New Money Habits Podcast. Remember, if you have any questions, make sure to hit us up on social at New Money Habits and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please consider leaving a 5-star rating and review to help us spread this message of hope to people looking for a better plan for their money.